welcome to the first panel of the day in Stream A. Very excited to be chairing this one, Yearning for Television Past, TV Revivals and Their Audiences. We've got three great speakers lined up, Bethan Jones, Ivan Phillips and Mareike. And we're starting with Bethan Jones. Bethan is a PhD candidate at Cardiff University. Bethan's work focuses on anti-fandom, toxicity and hate, and she's written extensively on the X-Files, popular culture and new media. Bethan's a founding board member of the Fan Studies Network and part of the streaming committee for the SCMS Fan and Audience Studies Special Interest Group. And her paper today is I'll See You in 25 Years, Manufactured Nostalgia and Life Course Fandom. So Bethan, I'm going to hand over to you. If I can just ask everybody else to turn their cameras off, even our other speakers, that would be really helpful. I'm going to do the same. And I will see you soon. Thanks, Bethan.
Well, thanks, Laura. And I think you can just see behind me my original cardboard cutout of Mulder and Scully, which I thought was quite appropriate for this conference, although it does sit behind me when I'm working anyway and causes quite a lot of comments. Now, I'm trying to share my screen and I'm getting a message that says host disabled participant screen sharing. Any ideas, Laura?
I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, should be all participants now, Bethan.
All right, let's have a look. There we go.
That's fine. I'll start your time after, all right?
Cool, right. Why is my F5 function not working? Come on. From the beginning. There we go. Oh, there's always something in there. Right. So I think as we can all see, and as this conference attests, nostalgia has been all over the place for the last few years, not least on our screens. We've had Star Wars and Star Trek, we've had Arrested Development, 24, Prison Break. Media properties have been rebooted, revived and otherwise revisited. And these have caused controversy, excitement and apathy on the way. So nostalgia has become the focus of a lot of academic work, as we'll see over the course of the conference. And what I'm interested in this paper is considering how fans react to revivals in relation to their fandom, their life course and their own understanding of nostalgia. And in particular, I'm looking at the X-Files and Twin Peaks. And I'm drawing on qualitative data that I gathered between 2015 and 2018 via surveys that were filled in by viewers of the show. The surveys generated just over 3,800 responses. So there's a hell of a lot that I can say about the shows, which I won't be doing obviously in this paper because of time constraints, but it is a really, really interesting area. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that my title has changed. The X-Files and Twin Peaks, they've remained part of the cultural lexicon since they went off air. And I didn't see any evidence in the research that said that the marketing, which did draw quite heavily on nostalgia, affected the way that fans received the show and affected how their nostalgia came into play. And that's not to say it didn't happen, and I'll probably come back to it another time, but it's not what I'm going to talk about in this particular paper. I imagine most of you are familiar with the show, so I'm just going to give a brief context to the revivals. Twin Peaks premiered in 1990. It ran for 2 seasons before being cancelled in 1991. A full-length film called Fire Walk With Me was released in 1992, and various tie-in books have been published over the years, including The Secret History of Twin Peaks, which was published before Twin Peaks: The Return. The Return, and I'm going to refer to it as The Return throughout. The Return was announced on October the 6th, 2014, written by David Lynch and Mark Frost, with Lynch directing. And Frost emphasised that the new episodes weren't a remake or a reboot, but a continuation of the series. Most of the original cast returned, and the series, which was shot continuously from a single long shooting script, was consisted of 18 parts. So The X-Files premiered in '93 and ended in 2002, but following the release of the 2008 film The X-Files, I Want to Believe, fans sort of mobilised to try and get Fox to greenlight a third film. That wasn't successful, but in summer 2014, Vulture published an interview with Chris Carter, who's the series creator, in which he said that conversations about a reboot were occurring. It was eventually confirmed in March 2015. David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson were reprising their roles as Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, and it ended up being a revival rather than a reboot. Season 10 reached 82.72 million viewers in the US, and that was enough for Fox to announce in 2017 that season 11 would be returning. And what I'm going to be focusing on mostly in this paper is season 10. So the first surveys I issued, which followed the announcement of the revivals, asked a range of questions about how fans felt when they first heard the news, if they felt the revivals were a good idea, generally how they felt about it. And a lot of them referred to nostalgia in their answers, which surprised me probably more than it should have. So for example, and you can see these in full on the screen. Respondent X800 wrote, "I realise a great deal of my fondness for the revival is nostalgia for the early seasons of the show and the friends I shared the experience of the show with." While respondent T20 said, "Twin Peaks holds a special place in my history and my heart. There's a nostalgia that will always make me giddy at the idea of returning to that world, but nostalgia is dangerous and it's easy to disappoint when the bar is set so high." And in case it's not obvious, respondents beginning with an X responded to my X-Files questions, and respondents beginning with a T responded to Twin Peaks. I also asked what fans hoped to see in the respective returns, and respondent T43 wrote, "Nostalgia for the first two series, lots of references and nods and Easter eggs, a similarity of tone and atmosphere, the great soundtrack, most of the same actors as possible," which was also echoed by respondent X543. So even before the revivals aired, there were various different concerns about nostalgia. There was a worry that the nostalgia that fans felt for the shows would be affected by the revivals or would affect their reaction to the revival series. The revival episodes might play too much on fans' nostalgia for the series' original runs to the detriment of new episodes. But at the same time, there was this acknowledgement that certain elements of nostalgia were required for the revivals to succeed. And I kind of feel that these responses demonstrate just how complex nostalgia can be. Siobhan Lyons has written that nostalgia is both a personal and a shared phenomenon. And thinking about these answers, which were replicated by a lot of respondents, I think we can see three sorts of nostalgia or three iterations of nostalgia that fans were particularly concerned about. So we've got spatio-temporal, which was nostalgia for the ways in which the show was consumed, either the time or the place. Textual, which is nostalgia for the elements of the show itself. And communal, which I'm saying is nostalgia for the fandom experience as a whole. And it's these three that I want to look at more closely in examining how fans reacted both to season 10 and to the return. I'm going to look at textual nostalgia first, not least because when I've been looking at the literature, a lot of the stuff on Twin Peaks looks at the text itself. There's far less work on nostalgia in relation to the X-Files revivals, which I find really interesting. So thinking about the return, Dan Hassler-Forrest suggests that fan culture around Twin Peaks has always been nostalgic because of the show's early cancellation. In his analysis of the return, he argues that despite the nostalgia-steeped teasers, which seemed to promise this kind of literal return to Twin Peaks, many fans didn't actually have a clue what to expect. And this is borne out by some of the responses to my survey, a couple of which are on the screen. Respondent T9 wrote, "I don't think a revival is a good idea if it's a nostalgia roadshow, which is what this seems to be. The appeal of Twin Peaks was that it was very, very different to anything else on TV. And when the appeal of a thing is that it's new, bringing it back from the dead to do the same old shit goes against that." Respondent T518 tried not to have too many expectations because they knew there's no predicting where David Lynch might take a film. They were excited to see what Twin Peaks would be like, knowing that the creators had full creative control, unlike in the original series, but they were still nervous that the soul might be missing itself. Now, both revivals were set in the present day, 25 years after the end of Twin Peaks and 8 years after the last X-Files film, and each demonstrated their fidelity to the original series in different ways within the texts. Season 10 contained myth arc episodes which kind of picked up on some of the original mythology of the original run, leaving some others behind. And it also had Monster of the Week episodes where Mulder and Scully go off and investigate paranormal phenomena. And Brinker, in his work on season 10, points out that thematically, these episodes cover precisely the kinds of topics that were a staple of the first 9 seasons. And several of the episodes had flashbacks to the original run, including One Breath, which is referenced in the GIF on screen, and season 8, where Mulder, Scully and Baby William are reunited. The return also featured scenes recalling the original series, but unlike the X-Files, these seem to be presented in a rather distorted fashion rather than a faithful replication. Rife and Wheeler talk about various different kind of flashbacks, for want of a better word, and they note that formerly adored characters or events were depicted in intensified or darkly surreal forms. And they give the example of the scene in the Bang Bang Bar, which references the iconic moment in the original series where Audrey Horne performs Dance at the Double R Diner. But the scene in the return becomes increasingly surreal until we cut to this scene, which is a close-up of Audrey looking quite confused in a mirror in a sterile environment, asking what? Now, Hassel Forrest writes about the return. If anything, it's more notable for its steadfast refusal to give fans what they want. But not all fans were surprised by that. And I've kind of alluded to that in one of the earlier quotes. Respondent T5 said, "I hoped we were going to see all the old cast members, and I hoped for a good nostalgia kick, but I fully expected David Lynch to make the audience work for that." And fans' knowledge of Lynch as auteur kind of meant they were prepared for the return to be edgy, innovative, challenging, not necessarily what they expected, but still in keeping with what they expect from Lynch. And you can kind of see this in the quote on the slide. This respondent had high expectations, knowing that Frost and Lynch were masterminding the episodes, and it also exceeded their wildest hopes. I said it's the first time they've seen a revival that was built for the most hardcore original fans with almost zero sacrifice to an uninitiated audience. So in other words, the return was nostalgic, not because it displayed textual nostalgia in the way that the X-Files did, but because it displayed the same characteristics that the original and Lynch were known for. Responses to season 10, if you're an X-Files fan, definitely, were far more mixed. Respondent X113 felt that the element of nostalgia and the acknowledgement of the impact of the series were essential. Respondent X22 wrote that some of the callbacks were a bit heavy-handed, but that was essentially unavoidable. And Respondent X436 placed the show in the context of today's media industry. They wrote, "I expected, hoped and was concerned it would be the classic X-Files. I worried if it would fit into today's television. I was concerned with content. Some episodes had such nostalgia that it really brought you back. Others felt like it never left the 90s in a bad way." Now, these responses suggest that nostalgia can be both a good and a bad thing when it comes to reviving old shows. Too much nostalgia, the wrong kind of nostalgia, can change what should be an enjoyable experience into something that can be unpleasant or disappointing. And I think respondent X9 kind of summed this up quite well, saying, Carter and the rest of the team seem to be ticking off boxes. We need to get as many iterations of X-Files episodes in these 6 as we can. Now, I've already noted that the revival did replicate a lot of the generic conventions of the original, but Brinker argues that the 2016 version of the X-Files revives the show's storytelling formula as part of a retrospective engagement with its own history. And fans similarly undertook a respective engagement with their own history of watching, describing the ways and times in which they would watch the show. And in other words, what I'm calling kind of spatio-temporal nostalgia. So, Rife and Wheeler, again, suggests that television creates a homely sensation through the comforts that arrive with habitual viewing. And I asked viewers how they watched the revivals and why. Many of the responses reflected what Rife and Wheeler suggest. So you've got respondent 8128 watching with friends and family just to share in the nostalgia and have more fun. T440 watched Twin Peaks as it aired, partly out of nostalgia because that's how they watched the original series, and partly because they couldn't wait and wanted to see it as it was available. Now, they streamed the episodes as they became available, but because they're based in Europe, this meant that there was quite a significant time difference. And there was something about watching it at a slightly mentally confused state at 3 AM that felt fitting with the atmosphere of the show and enhanced the feel of disorientation. But what I found particularly interesting were the fans who chose to recreate their old viewing practices. So respondent 8267 talks about watching it as it aired because they wanted the nostalgia of the original. The original relied heavily on commercial breaks and having this time in between episodes. So they tried their best to stick to that format. And they talk about appointment TV, which they miss because of streaming services, and say that X-Files was appointment TV for them in the 90s and now. Similarly, respondent T472 watched Twin Peaks as it aired, saying it was their first chance to watch the episodes of Twin Peaks as they were airing, and 8 o'clock on a Sunday became a sacred hour. They rearranged their schedule all summer to set aside time for it. And this idea of the revival as appointment TV was a common theme. Not only did fans want to avoid spoilers, but they saw it as an experience or an event to be engaged with rather than just passively watching. And this is, of course, different to the experience fans would have had watching back in the day. Twin Peaks and the X-Files fans are credited as being early adopters of the internet, but far fewer people would have had access to online communities than they do today. So being able to watch with others, live tweet, blog about the experiences and engage with fandom in other ways were among some of the ways in which fans took pleasure from the revivals, and reflections on both their individual and their shared fandoms were frequent in responses. So respondent X105 says season 10 brought them back into fandom. It inspired them to rewatch the series nostalgically and with a more critical eye, but it also introduced them to the fandom proper. And they talk about their experiences as a teenage fan when they didn't have the internet. Their fandom was their two best friends and their mother. So it's been fun to engage on Tumblr, and they may even read some fic, which they'd never done before. Talking about Twin Peaks, T292 said they first watched it in about 1995 when they were 14. They knew other fans, but it always felt like their special show because they watched it with their parents on a somewhat obscure cable channel. They say the thought of there now being new episodes to see, which I'll get to talk about with countless other fans online, seems surreal. And this is where I kind of come into talking about the life course of fandom. Harrington and Beelby have done extensive work on this, and they argue that paying attention to issues of aging, and human development can offer new insights into fans' identities, practices, and interpretive capacities. And I think that the same applies when we pay explicit attention to how fans talk about nostalgia. Fred Davis, back in 1979, presented this view of nostalgia as a mechanism that permits people to maintain their identity in the face of major transitions in their life cycle. So the tendency to engage in nostalgic feelings varies over the course of the individual's lifetime. And we can see that in some of these responses. And Harrington and Beelby note that media texts and technologies help unite cohorts, define generations, and cross-generational differences. and give structure and meaning to our lives as they unfold. So the reintroduction of an object which had some importance at a specific point in a fan's life can reignite those feelings, and it encourages fans to reflect upon the changes that they've gone through. And we see this, I think, with this respondent, X3. They wrote, "I was a huge X-Files fan when I was in high school, but after the original series ended, I moved on with my life. I never forgot about the X-Files. I had the complete series on DVD, but I didn't think much about it anymore. I'd moved on to other more current fandoms. The revival rekindled my love of the series and brought my teenage fangirl self back to the forefront. It reminded me how much I love the show, why I love the show, and it made me feel nostalgic for what was really my first fandom." So becoming a fan stories are central to fan studies, but in the context of revivals, this idea of re-becoming a fan seems to go hand in hand with an element of nostalgia for the fandom or the fan object that drew fans in the first place. And while becoming a fan may redirect the life course, so too may re-becoming a fan, where fans carve out space for something they thought they'd put to one side. Of course, fan objects age just as fans do, and I've already suggested that fans were worried about how the text aging might affect their own feelings towards the text. Harrington and Beelby point out that assessing the interactions between self unfolding across time and fan object unfolding across time is complicated. But in relation to revivals, I think we can see this duality of self-aging and text aging by looking more carefully at viewers' responses. And I think we can really see this in this response. Talking about how they felt about the return, T637 wrote, "It made me think a lot about my own life, depression, philosophies, intents and experiences in a deep way. I had two friends who had watched the original run, one of them with me. They're both dead now. It was hard knowing they'll never see the new episodes. I wanted to talk about it with them. It made me miss them and think about death and ghosts, and if I think an afterlife exists, and how important it is to be engaged in my life experiences, not walk through life waiting for something. So as fans grow older, their relationship with the fan object changes. Life events get in the way, other interests come to the fore, feelings change. But the revival of a show like The X-Files or like Twin Peaks, which plays a very significant part in the formation of the fanish identity, and in some respects, the non-fanish person identity, for want of a better word, offers fans the opportunity to revisit the people they were then and establish or cement the people they are now. So nostalgia in relation to revivals allows fan studies to understand the life course, both while fans age and while the text ages, and whether viewers move completely away from a text in the intervening years or treat it like a kind of warm blanket they come home to at the end of a heavy day. The feelings that a revival ignites can be complex, and the role that nostalgia plays in that can't be understated. Thank you.
Thanks, Bethan. That was fantastic. Next up, we'll have time for questions, Q&A at the end of the panel. We're going to go straight into our next speaker. So if I could ask Bethan to please turn your camera off as well for me. Thank you. Lovely. So our next speaker, you all good, Ivan?
Yeah, I'm here. Just trying to remind myself what I'm doing.
Okay. Okay, so our next speaker, Ivan Phillips. Ivan is Associate Dean here in the School of Creative Arts at University of Hertfordshire. His research interests include Romanticism, Gothic culture, modernism into postmodernism, 20th century poetry and experimental fiction, so running the whole scope. Ivan's monograph, Once Upon a Time Lord, The Myths and Stories of Doctor Who, was published last year by Bloomsbury. And Ivan is talking to us today about Doctor Who. The title of his paper is It's a Work in Progress, but So is Life, Doctor Who and the Haunted Fandom. And Ivan, I will hand over to you and leave you to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hello, everyone. I'm not used to speaking to people before 10 o'clock, so please bear with me. So as is often the case, I find that trying to compress things into 20 minutes, you sort of tiptoe around a lot of complex ideas. And I hope I don't oversimplify things more than I'd intended. Just a little bit about the title and the cover image, because I'm not going to go back to the title really, but the quote, "It's a work in progress, but so is life," is actually something said by Jodie Whittaker's doctor in her first full episode, which was The Woman Who Fell to Earth. And the emphasis for the purpose of the paper is on the word progress, I think. The image on the screen is from 2020's episode, The Haunting of Villa Diodati, which from a fanboy point of view was doubly wonderful for me because it enabled me to combine Doctor Who with one of my other fandoms, which is Gothic romanticism. Okay, so thinking about fandom generally, obviously Doctor Who is a very old thing as a TV artifact and as a wider cultural artifact. It will be 60 years old, 2023. There's a lovely quote from Miles Boy in his book Love and Monsters, where he talks about fandom, or fans before fandom, where he says there's no such thing as fandom when the programme began in 1963, but there were fans, however invisible. Actually, if you want to trace back the history of Doctor Who fandom in an organised way, the first fan community as such was in 1965. It was the official William Hartnell fan club, or William brackets Doctor Who Hartnell fan club, because of course at that time they had no idea anyone else would ever play the role. And a few little artifacts still survive. This is a letter written to Jackie Lane, who was played a companion called Dodo Chapler, not one of the most remembered companions, it should be said. 1975, the Doctor Who Appreciation Society formed, which had a much stronger kind of impact and a more long-lasting impact, and is known for its association with things like the Celestial Toy Room and TARDIS fanzines, one of which will come up later on in the paper. And then from my own view, when I started watching around 1972, when I was scared by a sea devil at the age of nearly 3, this thing here is the first issue of Two Weekly, as it was then. It's now a magazine, became a monthly quite quickly. Here's my copy. It's seen better days, a little bit like its owner. Looks like I had to eat it at one point. No idea where the transfers went. Appears that they were kind of torn from the paper. But that's really a very important point in terms of when fandom began to merge, I suppose, with the production side of things, and that's very much where we are now, with actors such as Peter Capaldi and David Tennant very well known as being fans of the programme. In fact, Capaldi was a member of the Doctor Who Society for many years, and producers Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall are, of course, lifelong fans as well. Okay, a few initial thoughts which will frame what I'm going to say and hopefully make sense of it. One of the things that's very noticeable about Doctor Who is its playfulness. There are debates within critical studies around Doctor Who, but also within fandom about how open and free the actual format of the programme is. But generically, I think it does allow for that constant crossing of genres between everything from sort of Western formats to Gothic, to comedy, to little bits of vaudeville at times. So there is that kind of ability to slip between genre boundaries, and also to pilfer source material. I can't think of many long-running franchises which are quite as intertextual in their ways of borrowing, and also, of course, across the years has developed a massive transmedia storytelling capacity, right the way back to 1964-5, when the first story cards came out in what were then sweet cigarettes, would you believe? Cigarettes that you could eat, and children bought these and they got small, sort of almost Twitter-sized story episodes featuring the Daleks and the probably forgotten by most people Vord, who was supposed to be a sort of rival monster, very much rubber-suited and quite kinky actually. Increasingly, of course, as the series developed, intertextual also became intratextual, as Matt Hills has said. lots of internal referencing and a build-up of what could be referred to and has been referred to as fan wankery. References which will please the fans, but casual viewers either won't get or will be deeply confused by. And at various points in the history of the programme, there's been lots of accusations about excessive fan wanking. The John Nathan Turner series in the 1980s, for instance, many people have blamed excessive internal referencing for the sort of disaffection of a casual audience and the demise of the programme in 1989. Other people have accused Stephen Moffat of similar levels of fan pleasing. But then, of course, not all fans are pleased, but they never are, which is kind of the topic of the paper. One of the things that's really noticeable about Doctor Who is change is built into the format. And I would say because change is built into the format, the minute they decided to turn one actor into another actor and allow this notion of of regeneration to happen, you automatically have not just renewal and change, but also built-in nostalgia, because the minute one Doctor becomes the next Doctor, fans have that moment of mourning and in many cases, a sense of grief and of resistance. It perhaps goes even more basically into the format. The TARDIS materialises and materialises, and as Kim Newman has said, each materialisation was also a reset. 1 week you could be in among the Aztecs, the next week you're on Skaro, and so on. I've just played with chronology in ways that some Doctor Who fans will never forgive me for. I was initially going to talk a lot about hauntology as a kind of theoretical perspective on this. I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time on it because it's quite complicated and I'd need another 20 minutes, I suspect. But one of the things that Mark Fisher very memorably said is that in conditions of digital recall, loss itself is lost. The notion of a culture that continually repeats itself and watches itself back, the fact that nothing is ever disposed of, it can all be summoned up on YouTube or on screen and so on. In actual fact, in Doctor Who terms, because the BBC in its wisdom decided to junk a load of recordings in the late 60s, early 70s, there are still many lost episodes from the 1960s, particularly from the Patrick Troughton era. And so even in the digital age, although there are now attempts to sort of animate these lost episodes, there is a kind of nostalgia and a mourning for the things which were lost to time. So in some ways, I think there's all sorts of ways in which a kind of post-object trauma is part of the Doctor Who fandom. We're always thinking about the Doctors before, we're always thinking about the stories we've seen in the past, and that's true of all fandoms, of course, but because of the longevity and the format of Doctor Who, I think it's particularly pronounced. And just to note about nostalgia, when I talk about nostalgia in terms of Doctor Who, I am talking about two particular forms. They're not easily distinguishable, I find, but psychological emotional nostalgia as felt by fans. So if I look at my first copy of Doctor Who magazine, if I dig out my old Target novels with my own childhood colouring in, if I look at my Doctor Who annuals from way back when, and the ones owned by my uncle, who's now passed on, so I now have this in my hand. These things are, they are nostalgic for me personally, but they have a kind of object nostalgia from, these are top trumps made by my mate at school. This is signed by Tom Baker. Objects, in other words, and the kind of emotional attachment that we have to them. But there's also, of course, the formal nostalgia of the series itself, which is that kind of internal referencing, but also building in visual references to past sets, past creatures, redesigns of monsters, but also perhaps nostalgia for different parts of culture. So, the Mummy on the Orient Express episode with Peter Capaldi, very much a nostalgia for sort of Agatha Christie whodunits and so on, and Universal horror films. A few points about fandom then. These are some, I think, quite telling quotations. Matt Hills has written about, specifically in relation to Doctor Who, but I think it applies to other fandoms. Being a fan means being disappointed by the object of that fandom as much as it means appreciating it. And I think that's something that's particularly pronounced in Doctor Who, and especially over recent years, as I will come to. Truth is, by the mid-70s, you had people who had grown up as primary school children watching Doctor Who were now teenagers and older than that, and they were already beginning to feel that it wasn't as good as it used to be. And this has always been a feeling in Doctor Who. It's not as good as it was when I was 7. It's not as good as it was 20 years ago, and so on. Miles Boy has written, the past was something desperately in need of recovery, and it always seemed to be somehow better than the present. And so you always ended up with what Boy refers to as hordes of teenage fans who knew the show was objectively better when they were 7. I think we've got that now with New Who, where people who grew up watching Eccleston and Tennant are now watching it and saying, well, it's not as good as when I was younger. That may or may not be true, but it's hard to filter it through the lens of nostalgia. Tulloch and Jenkins back in '95 had quite a utopian approach to fans. They talked about them as trying to develop a unified interpretive position and to become a cultural unit, an interpretive community. And to be honest, when you look at Doctor Who fandom, the more I look at it at the moment, the less it seems that they are making any attempt to be unified in any sense or to be an interpretive community. And in fact, what you often see is something that Tulloch, writing with Manuel Alvarado back in 1983 in the first ever full academic monograph on Doctor Who. They wrote, for long-term fans, the endless unfolding of the show's mythology is pleasurable only if the continuity of Doctor Who as institution is upheld. And I think often what we get at the moment with criticisms of Doctor Who are criticisms that some sacred institution is being disrespected. This again has always been the case. Hills again, and I think this is lovely because it captures very nicely that thing that everyone has their own idea of what a perfect Doctor Who story is, what a perfect Doctor is, what a perfect monster might be. There's always that sense of this is too much of this, not enough of the other, and so on. So Hill says the Doctor isn't in it enough. It isn't serious enough. It isn't science fictional enough. It isn't British enough. It doesn't have enough story. It has too much story. It assumes too much knowledge of continuity. It violates established continuity, and so on. Fan criticisms involve shaping an image of ideal Who, a kind of platonic essence of a series which may never have been fully realised in any one story. Because I'd say it has never been fully realised because it doesn't exist. There is no perfect Doctor Who story because everyone's got their own notion of what that would be. And Kim Newman similarly says, Who nitpicking boils down to a wish that the show was not a continually rewritten fiction, the obscured truth to be treated like the original canon and through for a definitive version. There is no canon. It's defined by the fans in a continually ongoing process, and the definitive version can never exist. And of course, what this leads to is fans loving the show, because they do, they are passionate to a fault, I think, and loving the show in what Boy refers to as monstrous ways. And this has been captured in sort of meta forms within the show itself. You've got Jan Samarco, better known as Adrian Mole for people of a certain age, Whiz Kid in an episode called The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, while Sylvester McCoy was the Doctor. So that's in classic Who. And then the members of Monsters, who are kind of around this legendary figure called the Doctor. Now, the point about this is now the creature, notoriously played by Peter Kay, was designed by a Doctor Who fan who sent it into Blue Peter, I believe. This is Peter Kay in full prosthetics. I hope they're prosthetics. And the point about all this, of course, is, you know, when you look at WizKid on the left there in Greatest Show in the Galaxy, and then you look at this image of a guy called Chris Chibnall, who was representing the Doctor Appreciation Society in a talk show called Open Air in 1986. Of course, that Chris Chibnall is the same Chris Chibnall who now runs Doctor Who and is famous for Broadchurch, but who is now, and it's quite famous that when he was on Open Air, he was extremely critical of the then showrunner, John Nathan Turner, and made lots of accusations about what was going on in the show, which have now come back to bite him through criticism of his own show running. Now, of course, what I'm really wanting to focus on, as I notice that I've got only 5 minutes left, is Jodie Whittaker's time as the Doctor. Her casting as the first female Doctor, or first biologically female Doctor at least, the announcement was made in the middle of Wimbledon in July 2017. And of course, for many people, and I don't want to overplay the sort of negativity, but that's the theme of the paper. For many people, this was a brilliant moment. But for many others, and this is a disclaimer, I'm going to show lots of stuff here which is frankly offensive, but I have to show it, I think, to show you the kind of stuff that's published. As soon as the announcement was made, you got hashtags like RIP Doctor Who, Not My Doctor. I checked the Facebook group for Not My Doctor yesterday. They've got 11 members and it's a private group, so they've kind of dwindled. But the kind of noise, you got US evangelicals like James Huckabee saying, Doctor Who died today. He didn't die nobly as you might expect. He was murdered by political correctness. Doctor Who is now a woman. She plans to go on maternity leave in 6 months and return part-time during office hours only. That's media goblin Katie Hopkins. Interestingly, Katie Hopkins' Twitter account has since been suspended and James Huckabee's vanished from Twitter altogether. Some kind of justice there. But then other fans, and I'm not going to read those out, you can read them for yourselves. They're not pleasant. And this is just an assortment, the same kind of things. And complaining about the same kind of stuff. Feminism has come and destroyed a great British classic TV show. This is an attack on the institution. Why has it become so PC? Snowflake generation. And I tend to agree with John Elledge, a New Statesman, where he said, this will annoy exactly the right people. And it did. And he talks about, you know, people who genuinely think white men are the true victims in this world. I think it's a very good piece, but they're very much caught the mood at the moment. But you did get, once the show began to, once Jodie Whittaker's Doctor began to appear in actual stories, so it wasn't just a sort of knee-jerk response, you still got lots of stuff about TV shows giving us subliminal PC lectures. Well, it's finally over after 48 years, so is the last drop of my love for Doctor Who. So sick and tired of this butchered remake show. I stuck through Mank, Eccleston, Cockney, presumably Tennant, autistic, particularly offensive way of describing Matt Smith's Doctor, Scottish, Capaldi, even a woman Doctor in shite stories, but now I'm out. This one here, incoming transmission from the Doctor, just go away forever and take that bollocks with you, the reference to Christian. How do you kill a show that's been a staple for over 50 years in just 2 seasons? Woke, bad writing, social justice, PC identity politics in our throats. Of course, that's just one narrative and one set of voices, and they're a minority. There is still huge amounts of enthusiasm and love and positivity, and particularly for Jodie's Doctor. And the people who love the 13th Doctor, this Chibnall era, really love it. My, I suppose, concern is that a lot of this is sort of fired up by, not surprisingly, certain areas of the press. So you get angry viewers have described recent episodes as lectures as the show explores issues like racism, male pregnancy and disabilities. So that was in The Sun. This is the Mail on Sunday, all my favourite sources of news. Doctor Who's become a tiresome ordeal of political correctness for some viewers. They do at least accept that. Jodie Whittaker stars in a debut series as the Doctor, but the show attracted ire. One of her companions is a dyspraxia sufferer, while one is Anglo-Asian Mrs. Khan. Last week, to travel back in time to the US civil rights movement, it's stated as a fact, sort of implicitly, that it's a bad thing. And Jeremy Clarkson waded in 2018. BBC is now only giving the frontline jobs to women just like Doctor Who, and they've totally lost the plot. The interesting thing is, this is a sort of bizarre Baudrillardian rant, as he acknowledges he doesn't watch the programme. I haven't watched Doctor Who since I was a small boy and I didn't understand it even then, but I'm told the current series is in trouble with viewing figures in free fall. And he talks about angry fans saying it's littered with ham-fisted attempts to ram left dogma down our throats. And it seems they do have a point. The Doctor has witnessed a man giving birth in a science fiction programme, can you imagine? And has visited a civil rights activist in Bama in the 1950s. That would be Rosa Parks, one of the most lauded episodes of recent years, and one of the most beautiful, I would argue, with perhaps the most shocking scene I've ever seen in Doctor Who, where Ryan, the Doctor's black companion, is slapped by a white man in the streets of Alabama for picking up the man's wife's glove. There is lots of stuff around the notion that there has been bad writing in the last couple of seasons, that there have been terrible stories. There's been complaints about violation of continuity, with a complete rewriting of the Doctor's backstory in the last series, The Timeless Child. I just want to point out, it's been pointed out by others apart from me, that this is not new. The Deadly Assassin, one of the most beautifully tautologous titles ever. I've never met an assassin who isn't deadly. Never met an assassin, I'm pleased to say. One of my favourite stories, many people's one of the favourite stories of classic Who, although noticeably no female characters at all, not even a companion, and no of colour that I can remember. but a fantastic story, very much of its time, featuring a very degenerated and rotting corpse-like master. At the time it was broadcast, it's now seen as a classic and defining of this canonicity of Gallifrey and the Time Lords, which has now been violated. At the time, TARDIS fanzine published a review which was incredibly critical and which ended in capital letters with "What has happened to the magic of Doctor Who?" So the kind of things that are discussed are not new. So there are issues which, if I had time, I would go deeper into, you know, classic Who in relation to its representations of race. You know, some of the stories that have been in recent years, like the Rosa Parks story, like the casting of a Black Doctor, like Demons of the Punjab. These are, I think, very finely written and finely judged stories. I could do an entire other conference paper and probably a book about the depictions of race. You know, if you go back to Doctor Who in the classic series, you have characters in blackface. There's Saladin in The Crusade, that's Bernard Kay, and then notoriously one of the, in some ways, one of the greatest stories of Doctor Who, Talons of Weng Chiang, but also one of the most openly racist, in which you have John Bennett, a white actor made up to play a Chinese character. There's been complaints about lots of stuff in the recent series to do with themes of pollution, environmentalism, and that this is PC and social justice warrior. But those happened in the 60s. Fury from the Deep, top left there. Green Death, top right there. Lovely quote from Jodie Whittaker's Doctor in the episode The Witchfinders. "These are hard times for women," she says. "If we're not being drowned, we're being patronised to death." There were attempts in the old series to cast strong female characters, but they were always subservient, the Doctor's assistant and so on, even if they were professors and scientists and computer whizzes. I'm going to zip through these. To my conclusion, Doctor Who has a troubled history in terms of things, you know, so if you look back across a 60-year history, you will find things which in modern terms don't stack up very well. And often I think it lost sight of its progressive roots. You know, Doctor Who, perhaps a sign of the BBC at the time not having much faith in the programme, they gave the work to the people they didn't think they would give other more important work to, but it actually had a counter response in some ways. The first producer of Doctor Who was Verity Lambert, a young female producer who had the guts to stand up against Sidney Newman and to put in bug-eyed monsters in the shape of the Daleks, which really is what made the series work and made it last. Delia Derbyshire, top right there, who did the astonishing electronic arrangement of Ron Grainer's theme music, which is so memorable. Even people who've never seen Doctor Who know the music. And bottom right there is Waris Hussain, who directed the first ever story, an Asian gay man in the early 1960s being given a prominent role in the BBC. So the progressiveness is not a new thing. It was there at the start. It maybe got lost in places. This constant recourse of the negative anti-Jodie, anti-Chibnall brigade always goes back to the fact, why is it so woke? Why is it so progressive? Why is it so P? Why is it SJW? But actually, that's not something that you can't find in classic Who. It's just more problematic. What I want to say is, in my final point, is it seems to me the negative voices about Doctor Who in recent years, to me it blanks out whether there is good or bad writing, because it's very hard to distinguish between justified concerns about the quality of the writing or the acting in the programme and the sort of ranting noise of people who are, to use a term which Mark Fisher adopts from Gilbert, post-colonial melancholy. The colonialists, and most of those Twitter posts which I showed are from, oh dear, I'm overrunning, apologies. Most of those Twitter posts that I showed
I need you to wrap up, Ivan, please.
Okay, this is the final thing. Mark Fisher says the post-colonial melancholic doesn't just refuse to accept change. At some level, he refuses to accept that change has happened at all. He incoherently holds on to the fantasy of omnipotence by experiencing change only as decline and failure, for which naturally the immigrant other must be blamed. And much of the toxicity against the current regime of Doctor Who seems to me to be founded on that kind of approach. Thank you, and apologies for overrunning, Laura.
Thank you very much, Ivan. We'll go straight into our third speaker. Excellent, there you are. Okay, so Mareike Jenner, Senior Lecturer in Media Studies at Anglia Ruskin University. And Mareike's research focuses on contemporary television, television genre, and streaming. She's the author of American Detective Dramas, published by Palgrave in 2015, and Netflix and the Reinvention of Television, published by Palgrave in 2018. And she's the editor of the forthcoming collection, Binge Watching and the Future of Television Studies, from Edinburgh University Press, due this year. And Mareike's paper today is The Cultural Politics of the Nostalgic CBS Action TV Reboot. Thanks very much, Mareike.
Thank you. Sorry, let me just check, and full screen would be good as well. There we are. Okay, so thank you, Laura. I'm currently working on kind of a project on Action TV, which is very much in its very early stages. But one of the things that I find really, really fascinating is kind of the cultural politics of more highbrow or more middlebrow TV, which and particularly this kind of level of middlebrow action TV that is actually very rarely talked about. And I'm talking particularly today about Hawaii Five-0, Magnum Pi, and the MacGyver reboot, which were all produced by CBS. So I want to start out by giving a brief overview of the generic category of action TV. So it's a bit like the nostalgia genre in itself as well. It's a bit of a meta genre that kind of like has one very, very dominant feature that is kind of part of more traditional genres as well. So for action TV, which is slightly different than for action cinema, Bill Ogerby and Anago Yates, where I'm quite sure I just really messed up her name, who wrote an edited collection on action TV, and Toby Miller's definition in the TV genre book, all very, very much emphasize fight scenes as the dominant feature for action TV. So this means physical fights, fist fights, blah. This means car chases. It can also mean chases on foot. So there are some quite creative parkour-inspired chases, and obviously explosions and generally special effects. Action TV, like I said, it's a bit of a meta genre. It kind of functions within more traditional genre categories. So fantasy is one of those categories. For example, Buffy is quite frequently used as an example. Obviously, the detective drama in general, as all Hawaii Five-0, MacGyver, and Magnum Pi, but also, for example, Lethal Weapon, the TV series, or Spy, which is probably the earliest version of action TV. In general, because if you think back to the 60s to Mission Impossible, obviously it functions then. It's still continued with series like The Americans, even if it's not that dominant anymore, largely because it does a lot with the Cold War, and the Cold War is over. So, like I said, I'm talking about these 3 CBS series. It's quite important to say, to give a bit of a disclaimer about this. All of those 3 series are produced by Peter Lankoff. Peter Lankoff was fired in 2020 for extremely abusive behavior. Maureen Ryan wrote a very lengthy piece in Vanity Fair about that entire case, which I really, really recommend because it's very well written. But what I'm interested in is what CBS is kind of reaching for with those reboots. So obviously there's a lot of play with signifiers of the past, which we can see. But what I think is probably even more important is that by rebooting these specific 3 series, they're signaling a return to not quite TV2, because Y50 is technically still TV1, but a return to broadcast television. They're signaling specific kind of narrative structures. They're signaling specific kinds of narrative emphases. To a certain extent, they're even signaling a certain kind of political direction. And I find this quite important because Bethan also made the point earlier about the entire idea that the nostalgia can also be just for a specific kind of TV and a specific kind of television experience, rather than necessarily the text itself, even though, like I said, there's like a longer list down there, in terms of how signifiers of the past are important here. So what is also quite relevant here is really the industrial context of not just why these reboots or what these reboots are signaling, but also what CBS is kind of thinking about this. CBS, there's not that much written about CBS as a channel, at least not past 2000. So there's this article by Valerie Johnson for 2000, where there's the quote on slide. Derek Compare wrote a blog post in 2010 about CBS. And Maureen Ryan also kind of discusses this a little bit in her piece on Peter Lankoff. So the thing is, like, essentially all of these texts very much deal with a sort of, with like codes. Derek Compare's probably most straightforward in kind of saying, okay, their niche appears to be middle-brow television, at least at the moment. And I would argue it's still the case. So at the time Compare was writing, CBS relied a lot on franchises, predominantly CSI, and then NCIS, which kind of started out as more or less a copy of CSI. Kind of pivoted towards the 2010s as the interest in forensic detection kind of waned. So they very much went into a direction of more action-based storylines and more international spying and all of that. And in that context, NCIS Los Angeles was launched, which is much more straightforwardly an action series, with all the elements that that action series encompass, and they and to be fair, it's like where with NCIS the institutional context is, at least in the beginning, relatively clear. NCIS LA, it's really not clear what they're doing or why they're doing it. There's just a lot of explosions, which is fine. And a year later, because obviously that series turned out to be quite successful, they launched a Y50, where the franchise potential wasn't really all that clear, but it functions within that same idea of middlebrow TV. The institutional context is a bit clearer there, but they have like unlimited means and no accountability. So essentially, again, it's the kind of action TV where the characters just get to do whatever they want. What CBS seems to be aiming for with all of those series is what Valerie Johnson calls these mass multiple generation unhip demographics. Compare looks more at the text and goes more like this is middlebrow TV, and Maureen Ryan in that horrible thing that TV journalists sometimes do is kind of doing this thing of like, you dear reader have probably never heard of this because it's not quality TV, but it's really popular in flyover country, whatever that may be. So in her text, the kind of class disdain that is implicit here is probably the most obvious. But politically speaking, CBS is also, because it's reaching back to broadcast television, also with those reboots, and that's what it's trying to signal. It's also trying to signal kind of political neutrality. Obviously, that's not possible, but the kind of promise it seems to be making is we're not getting explicit about identity politics or anything like that. Now, the thing is that doesn't mean it doesn't do that. So, as Thomas Leitch points out in Twice Told Tales, these reboots are very, very much renegotiating the politics of the past because they do emphasize more racial diversity. So if you look at on the slide that image of Hawaii 5.0, which is the image with the most people in it, what you see there is actually quite interesting because, of course, you have the two white dudes at the front, but everybody who's behind them is not ethnically white, and you have quite a lot of diversity and also in an Asian diversity, which makes sense because we're in Hawaii. And in the last few seasons of Hawaii 5.0, those two white dudes often barely featured. Sometimes one of them just wasn't there at all. Sometimes it was kind of like the two of them, but they were in like a very marginal storyline. So you have a lot of racial diversity within this text. Now, don't get me wrong, this is very much skin deep diversity, because when the series started, it was a team of those two white dudes plus Daniel Day Kim and Grace Parks. And when Hawaii 5.0 started, Daniel Day Kim had just come off Lost, and Grace Parks had just come off Battlestar Galactica. So they were both technically the biggest stars. And still weren't being paid the same amount as the two white dudes. And when in season 7 they insisted that they should get equal pay, they didn't get it, so they left, which means that like all the people who are now standing between the white dudes will never ever get the seniority of getting equal pay either. So within the industrial context, you definitely do not have equality, but you do have racial representation on screen. To move to the picture below that, that's from Magnum Pi, where there's also, like, they made some changes which are quite significant. It's also quite important that it's probably the most liberal text of all of them. Like, they declared their solidarity with Standing Rock and things like that. So what Magnum Pi did was, first of all, they exchanged the character of Magnum is now played by a Latino actor. There's a recurring character who's played by a disabled actor. they made Higgins a woman, which also again shows some of the complications with this, because while you now have a female character within like the major characters there, you also like they changed a character who was older than Magnum, who had quite an explicit queer subtext in the relationship, to a woman who's younger than Magnum, and they made it into like a heterosexual will they or won't they thing. So it's not entirely unproblematic what's happening here. However, it is quite remarkable. All of them have a lot of female action heroines. So particularly on Magnum Pi, Perdita Weeks is doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to fight scenes. But as Lisa Purse points out in her book on action cinema, a lot of this is kind of like in the context of reestablishing a patriarchal order. So a lot of these women are kind of part of heterosexual romances. They're love interests of the male hero. They have the will they or won't they thing. And particularly obvious on Magnum, what you have is that Higgins is incredibly associated with the victims. So you have her doing the empathetic gestures, as you see in the other image on the bottom, where they're looking at the laptop. By the way, it's like all the male characters. If you see, I cut this out, but if you see the whole screen, all the male characters are standing around there as well, but she's the one with the hand on the shoulder. They have a lot of children who are victims, and she usually spends the entire episode hanging out with them, and then shares a fight scene. One of the things that is really, really common for generally Peter Lenkov produced series is that those action heroines are very petite. So they all kind of have that thing of like, well, you wouldn't expect this tiny woman to be this strong. So there is a reestablishing the patriarchal order on many different levels. On MacGyver, you also have a very classic thing where you have this very young female character who is supposed to be smarter than everybody else, who always has a very pronounced cleavage. So in terms of gender politics, it's always very, very much a mixed bag, and it's kind of stuck in definitely an earlier period. All of those series do, and I find this quite important in terms of the values that are represented in these series, is an incredible fetishization of the military. And what I find really interesting is that a lot of those characters are veterans from Afghanistan, which I think is quite unusual because American military usually kind of like either like did a tour in Afghanistan and then a tour in Iraq. Like it's very, very unusual to, or at least in the stories that you have in the media, to focus on only one of those wars. But obviously the story here is, a lot simpler. So essentially those characters saw 9/11 and then they signed up for the military. So it's a relatively simple story of heroism that is being told here, rather than getting into the more complicated Vietnam War stories. So to conclude then, what we're dealing with here is very much a yearning for a different kind of broadcast TV, which appears to be more difficult to get in a time that is so politically polarized as today. But they are very much signaling this cultural niche and a specific value system within that. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mareike. Wonderful. If I could ask our three panelists to join us with their cameras and mics on, that would be great. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker, our planned fourth speaker today, has had to withdraw, so this does mean that we've got plenty of time for questions, and if we finish a little early, it just gives people a little time away from the screen, so I'm not going to be mad about it. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions either in chat, or if anybody wants to turn their mic and camera on, that's fine. Just note that you'll be recorded if you do that. I'm just going to give it a sec for people to pop up here. Vincent's got his hand up.
Hello, am I coming through?
You are. Hello.
Huzzah. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for three really intriguing papers. I've got a question that's kind of for both Ivan and Mareike. Both of you spoke about the idea of renegotiation of gender and racial politics in reinterpretations, reboots of pre-existing properties. And my question is, do you think that the nostalgia associated with pre-existing properties like Doctor Who and Hawaii Five-0, do you think this nostalgia is a benefit or a hindrance for the renegotiation of gender and racial politics, perhaps in comparison to other original shows like Vikings, Designated Survivor, Billions, and so on? So yeah, do you think the nostalgia helps or hinders renegotiating these cultural politics?
Sorry, Ivan, do you want to?
I'm happy for you to go first if you.
Okay, no, that's fine. So I think the thing is they took a lot of creative liberty in those reboots for in those action TV reboots, in terms of they did write original female characters, which like they don't necessarily have the properties of the people who came before. Like in Magnum Pi, she has dogs, which is kind of like reaching back, but it's not really a gender property. And on Hawaii Five-0, they took even more creative liberties. So I don't necessarily think, well, the thing is, I don't think it should be a hindrance. I don't think it has to be a hindrance, considering that they're writing those female characters from scratch, which is not the same as in Doctor Who. So it shouldn't be. And I don't think it is, because I think that the nostalgia doesn't necessarily rely on the idea that everybody has seen the 1968 season of Hawaii Five-0. Which again is different from Doctor Who. But so yeah, I don't actually think the nostalgia very much plays into it.
I think that's right. I think Doctor Who is quite distinct in the sense that it is this thing that Tulloch and Alvarado call the unfolding text. Its continuity, as well as its kind of disjunctions, means that it's always going to be a challenge. So I think it's a really good question. I think it's inevitably going to be a challenge, and I suppose part of what I'm nudging towards is, maybe this is blindingly obvious, but it's a challenge, but also it's a red rag to a certain kind of area of fandom and of the casual viewer who's quite happy to stir up fandom for a certain kind of quite reactionary purpose. And I think that's what we've seen in the last few years. You know, the notion that Russell T Davies's New Who didn't include, for instance, characters. There were revisions of ideas of sexuality, of relationships. There were people of colour cast outrageously, of course, in the eyes of some people. But it's not as if Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker invented modern Who, and the fact, you know, that these things happen. So I think it's always going to be a challenge, and I think it's always, and in some ways it becomes more important, because in some ways I think it gives us a chance to reassess classic Who in the light of New Who, and to recognise that there are things in classic Who that were actually far more progressive than they can credit for. I was thinking this morning, William Hartnell's final story, The 10th Planet's first Cyberman story, involves a space flight, and one of the astronauts is a black American actor, and I think quite striking. He died quite recently, but I think it's quite striking that Doctor Who in 1966 was about 20 years ahead of the US space program in having a person of color as an astronaut. So it's not all. It's quite a complex set of ideas, but I think the challenge posed by the reboot is really important for reassessing the classic, but also in, I think, recalibrating how we watch television, how we watch drama.
Great, thank you both.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Will Albers.
I can't start my video apparently, but I can ask my question.
Okay, no problem. I might be able to. Let me just see.
Ah, okay.
There we go.
Wonderful. I just want to show off my room. Anyway, thank you for those papers. They were really, really interesting. I really enjoyed Bethan and Ivan both talking about programs that I absolutely love but haven't researched myself, so I found that fascinating. I'm on season 4 of the X-Files at the moment and working through it very slowly, and love Twin Peaks. And I wanted to, this isn't my question, but I might just mention that I had a particular experience, which might be nascent TV academic experience, in that I hadn't watched Twin Peaks before the revival, but was able to watch the entire thing in 2016 in preparation for it coming back, and otherwise would probably not have done so still. So that's kind of another side of the view. But anyway, I kind of have, and I really enjoyed Mareike's paper as well. I don't have a question for you, Mareike, I'm afraid, but I just enjoyed learning about something new. But I have a kind of small question for both Beth and Ivan, different questions. So I might ask one at a time, if that's okay. So Bethan, it just occurred to me as you were talking that I think I might be misattributing this, but I think it's Helen Wheatley who's talked about the original Twin Peaks being itself nostalgic for a kind of 50s America and that kind of aesthetic that it uses. So I'm wondering if there's an argument here that actually the original series is more nostalgic than the 2017 revival, in that kind of rejects nostalgia in a lot of ways, and that it doesn't do what one of your participants expected or wanted, in that it doesn't use the same music a lot. A lot of it isn't even set in the town of Twin Peaks, doesn't do many of the kind of nostalgia things that were expected of it. So is there perhaps an argument there, and the original series is more nostalgic than the?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to remember if it was one of my respondents or if it was an academic that I've read who said it, but they were definitely talking about how the original Twin Peaks is very nostalgic for, like I said, the 1950s, but there's also this background of the Cold War that exists, which obviously we don't have in terms of the return. I haven't really looked at that in a massive amount of detail, partly because I had so many responses that for this paper I looked at specific questions because otherwise it would have taken so long to get through everything. But yeah, there is definitely that, and it was pointed to by at least some of the respondents that I've looked at their answers. There's almost like this dual layer of nostalgia going on. You've got the nostalgia in the original for kind of the 50s, and that's very kind of set up. And then you've got the nostalgia for fans looking back at the original whilst also being aware that the original is a nostalgic piece of text itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
so at the level of, Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say I can't really say more than that because it's not something that I've like massively looked into for this paper, but yeah, it's definitely an element of it.
Yeah, great. It's sort of a level of nostalgia that the original Twin Peaks could never get to because it was cancelled so soon. Whereas, not that I've got very far through the X-Files yet, but I have a feeling that by season 9, it might well be kind of calling back to the earlier kind of golden years because it was just ran by that long at that point. Yeah, thank you. Can I ask my question to Ivan now as well? Would that be okay? I don't want to.
Yeah, of course. We've got time.
Great, thank you. Ivan, and again, just another thing that occurred to me as you were talking, and the thing that I remember reading in Doctor Who magazine relatively recently, which I got for a year, I don't get it anymore, but I did have a little look in for a bit, and it was that the kind of flip side to what you're talking about old fans complaining about the politics of the new series, in that I remember seeing an article about newer fans and younger newer fans trying to kind of reconcile the politics of serials such as Talons of Weng-Chiang in particular, in the kind of these serials that they were enjoying for their kind of Doctor Who qualities, but having to kind of reconcile these kind of troubling politics and these yellow face actors in that serial in particular, and trying to kind of put those two things together and kind of not accept that, but also kind of enjoy the serial for what it is, and negotiating those two things. So I'm wondering if that's something you've thought of before as a kind of other side to the kind of fandom that you're talking about in your presentation.
Yeah, definitely, and it's something that as a reader of Doctor Who magazine, you do get, because they have a group of people who rewatch old episodes, and they're generally slightly younger than me.
Yes, that's what they were.
They seem, yeah, and I think in some ways, I mean, there's a lot of nonsense spoken about the sort of unforgivingness of the younger generation and cancel culture and so on. But I find generally younger, so fans of new Who watch old Who, classic Who, tend to be quite forgiving of its historicity. It is from where it is, and I think it makes it quite hard for them to, as you say, to engage in a way, because you're kind of distracted by some of the quirks, and it's interesting because actually it can be very revealing for an older fan like me, because the whole notion, for instance, that the Deadly Assassin had no female characters, had no characters of colour, I think I'd probably got into my 40s before I even noticed that, which is quite telling, and it was only pointed out to me by a younger fan who said, "You have noticed this, haven't you?" And I went, bloody hell, no. So I think that kind of blindness to things which are quite important, and which mean that you have to kind of adjust your own view of your favourites. Whereas things like Talons of Weng-Chiang, even I couldn't miss the problems with that story and the way it was presented, and not just the fact you have a white actor made up to play a Chinese character, but the fact that the stereotyping of sort of Chinese gang culture in Victorian London is, it's straight out of a 1940s sort of Sherlock Holmes. So yeah, I think, but it's obviously it's a challenge. My own try and watch bits of classic Who with me. They can't help but comment on that stuff. But I think it's important. A franchise with that length of history, it has to be constantly in negotiation with itself to understand where it's come from, where it's going, and the continuities and the changes. I think that's quite important. I have to say, by the way, your experience of Twin Peaks is quite common. I think the notion of actually sort of binge watching the whole of the original to then pick up on the new, and I think that's quite an interesting area. I think the original series
we can do that we couldn't do 20 years ago.
Absolutely, and I think that's another thing. In relation to Doctor Who, my only access to stuff that was shown before I was born was to read the Target novels. I couldn't, they weren't even on video until the sort of 90s. So I think that access that my daughter's generation now have to the back catalogue, and I think it's the problem my middle daughter, for instance, has with classic Who is not the dodgy representation and so on, but it's actually the sheer amount of it. The fact that there are lost episodes is probably a good thing from her point of view, because she doesn't even know where to start. because
Yes.
of the sheer
I've
time.
only just finished. I'm a very slow television watcher. I started Classic Who in about 2008, and I finished Sylvester McCoy a couple of months ago. So that's how long it takes.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, so I think we'll move on. We'll move on to those if that's okay. Lots of chance for chat in Discord at a later date, at a later point. So a question from Charlotte Durham. Something that Bethan hinted towards, but open to all presenters. How do you view the Boba Fett effect, the delayed release of information, playing into audience experiences of TV reboots or revivals which have a pre-existing fan base or fandom? Would you like me to repeat? I realised I was reading it for the first time as I was reading it out. Yeah, so the idea of the delayed release of information playing into audience experiences of reboots and revivals which have a pre-existing fan base.
So in terms of the delayed release of information, is there any clarification on that? So stuff coming out from cast,
unless Charlotte has something, unless Charlotte wants to clarify.
Welcome to do with the Mandalorian effect. So Boba Fett was originally a kind of minor background character, but nevertheless fetishized by fans who wanted the little figure. But I think the Mandalorian's given him an entire backstory. Is that?
I'm guessing so. Sorry, Charlotte, if we're not quite getting this.
If I take hold of it from that point of view, and I think that's particularly interesting from a Doctor Who point of view, because the backstory, you know, the Doctor begins in 1963 with absolutely no backstory and doesn't really get one for quite some time, you know, best part of a decade until we meet the Time Lords and discover a little bit. Gallifrey's not named until 1974. I think, you know, you've not only got a very slow release of detail about the main character, but about other characters as well. And then you have this very, very complex transmedia expansion. So the 90s, when the show for most of the world was dead, you actually have this massive proliferation of original novels, some of which were very adult, with very adult themes, written by people who would go on to often write this for the series, like Paul Cornell and Rob Shearman and so on, and Audio Adventures. And of course, they all add their own details. And then you get canon wars breaking out. So even something relatively small, like in the 1996 Paul McGann movie, where it's referred to that the Doctor is half human on his mother's side, that's a major kind of thing dropped into the timeline of the series and is debated to this day. And I think the great pleasure for Doctor Who in a sense is it doesn't really matter. You can just argue about these things. The slow release of information just gives you stuff to talk about when there isn't other stuff to do in life. Quite good for lockdowns, I suppose.
Definitely. Does anybody else want to pick up? We've got other questions, so I can move on if there's nothing anybody wants to raise.
I was just thinking about it in terms of like paratext, so information that comes out maybe after the fact, or you know, during the run on a paratextual basis. So like J.K. Rowling saying that Dumbledore's gay after, you know, the series is finished, and how fans respond to that. But I think that may be a slight tangent. So if anyone wants to talk about that, I'll come back to it at a later point.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Craig Mann for Ivan. Have you seen much evidence that negative responses to Jodie Whittaker's Doctor were in any way organised? Purely because it reminds him of reactions to, say, Ghostbusters and Star Wars, where the issue of female protagonists in established media franchises was seized upon by the alt-right as part of wider culture wars, which he guesses relates to the fact that Jeremy Clarkson jumped on it when he hadn't even seen the thing. Fair point for Ivan.
Yeah, which I think is, well, there is a level of organisation, not very effective organising. As I say, my Doctor page on Facebook is pretty much inactive at the moment. I mean, there are private groups, so Lord knows what they're saying to each other. But I noticed, I mean, the hashtags were set up to give a kind of frame of organisation. When I was researching for the book that I published last year, that's not a plug. That's just it's not intended as one. it was very noticeable to me that there were various little social media groups that had kind of sprung up around the Jodie Whittaker announcement, which were attempting to give a kind of body and organisation to that particular viewpoint. They didn't really gain a lot of momentum, I have to say, you know. And when I did something really basic, like compare the number of members of Not My Doctor groups or RIP Doctor Who groups, they were much smaller in terms of numbers of members than, for instance, the Time Ladies group on Twitter, which has a massive following. You know, so I think for the purposes of the paper and for time, I had to focus on the kind of negative stuff. But really, it seems it's not organised in any way which is particularly systematic or effective. It's just a kind of constant background noise, which I think affects the wider debate and discussion around the programme. I think it obscures discussions about the writing, about the casting, about the dynamic of the TARDIS crew and so on. I think you get this kind of constant sort of fizz in the background of sort of Clarkson voices going, woman doctor, or, you know, and I think, but it doesn't seem very organised. Having said that, you know, the wider ripples of that entire kind of approach to life have had major impact over the last 5 years, you know. So I can't say that the casting of Jodie Whittaker had any impact on American politics or Brexit or anything, but you know, it's part of the same cultural discourse, I think. And in that sense, organised or not, it's quite troubling to me.
Yeah, definitely. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in the chat, but I know that Derek had his hands up before these latest ones came in. So if Derek wants to join us.
I'll try to, if I can manage to get
Hi,
how
Derek.
to undo my video. There we go. Thank you all. I'll try and make a quick observation, I suppose, that Ivan might want to pick up about Talons of Weng-Chiang was, of course, that was also in some ways nostalgic for other productions and, of course, for the Victorian Imperial project. And what might be interesting to think about there is when something like that gets revisited by, say, Mark Gatiss in the Crimson thing that I've forgotten, where he's using modern production techniques, but that's the one, but kind of going back to those kinds of stories, but reframing them. The question I had was for Bethan, and I found it really interesting about the different kinds of nostalgia you were talking about, but what struck, and particularly about people revisiting and reframing their life experiences when re-encountering these series. And I suspect something similar might have happened for some people, particularly with the starts of the series that Mareike was talking about. You know, will this Hawaii Five-0 be like my Hawaii Five-0? And one of the things that, for me, was seeing the images of these actors and then thinking, so the question, did you get any responses which were people reflecting on how their nostalgia, their responses engaged with seeing the visible evidence that these actors have aged, these characters have aged and have passed on? Yeah, there was a lot of that. I looked at it in a different paper, and I can't remember what I argued now, but there was particularly when I think it was the first season 10 came out, the Daily Mail ran this article on Gillian Anderson and kind of how Scully is aged, but they took great pains to point out, oh, you know, there's no forehead lines, so she's clearly had Botox, and her nose looks different, so she's clearly, you know, had a nose job, and look how good she looks for however old she is. And there was a lot of fanish kind of backlash to that, with a lot of fans taking that that image and then reframing it with their own look at Scully's eyebrows, she has no time for your shit, that kind of thing. In comparison to how fans viewed Duchovny, because he, bless him, did look a lot older in season 10 than he did in the earlier seasons. And there was this not concern, but just this recognition that he is not the same
Mulder as he was, you know, back in the 90s and the early 2000s. More so than Gillian Anderson, actually, because, like, she, you know, she dyed her hair Scully red, and she still looked like Scully, but Duchovny looked older, and there was kind of some almost paratextual or intratextual comments that you know, clearly his life as Hank Moody has aged him, so because Duchovny played a womanizing, drinking, alcoholic writer called Hank Moody in Californication. So there was this kind of merging of these two texts when it came to Duchovny, and the fact that he looked a lot older. Again, it is something I've skimmed over briefly just because of the sheer amount of data, but there's definitely this recognition that the characters have aged, and there was an element of worry that that the actors aging would affect the characters, and you know what they could do. And actually there's a bit in Home Again, which was the 4th episode of season 10, where Mulder says he's going to take the lift and he's not going to take the stairs. And so he's like, God, back in the day, you know, I would have been running upstairs wearing 10-inch heels. So there's this diegetic knowledge that the characters aren't the same as they were back in the day as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking more about how it encouraged the viewers to think about how they have also changed, thinking about, say, you know, Mulder fiddling around with the new camera app on his phone, and then go, oh yeah, new technology is great, but I have those problems. But
yeah, there seemed to be less of that. There was worry about how the characters would engage with technology, because obviously it was so different to what was there back in the day. But the reflections seemed to be less on kind of the technological changes and more their personal life experiences and how that and their fandom has changed over the years.
thank you.
Thanks very much, Derek. I think we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. They're just flowing in now. So I think if we do, we're going to run out of time, I think, but we've got time for a couple more. Anything that I miss, if I don't get to your questions, participants might like to just check the chat afterwards and see if there's anything that they'd like to reply to. Alternatively, obviously, you can catch up elsewhere. Okay, so I've got one from Mike Wild. I'm just going to read it out. So this is me as Mike. In the TV shows discussed among all three is a kind of desire for a return to innocence for the viewer. TV shows that were often watched when viewers were young adults or even children, and whose expectations changed as adults. So the reboots have a tendency, I think, to lean more on contemporary, what would have been thought of as quote unquote adult themes, or that's my feeling. I'm thinking Captain Jack in Doctor Who, gay storylines in 5-0, etc. Is my feeling right? Captain Jack isn't a generic gay character from, say, Doctor Who. He's quite gristly. Not sure exactly where I'm going, but the nostalgia for the past gave way to more contemporary storytelling, almost using the show as a kind of culture jamming. Yeah, I wonder, Mareike, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the major changes is that they kill. Police detectives didn't really, or at least tried not to kill anyone in the 70s and 80s. Even Magnum also uses a gun very, very rarely. So I think the major update as far as like adult storylines goes is actually in terms of violence. Hawaii 5-0 actually quite famously didn't have any gay characters for a really, really long time, and was like the center, like shipping central for the two major characters, to the extent that you could even talk about queer baiting. And it was a bit surprising that they didn't have any gay characters kind of unload that subtextual energy, which is a strategy that network TV often uses nowadays. So yeah, I really think the major textual update is the killing part.
Would anybody else like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the Captain Jack is interesting. I think that's interesting. He's just been brought back, because that's a character who, you know, there were comments and questions and a degree of sniping when he came into the series in 2005, but it's interesting that when he returns, there's a lot more discussion now, because he's in the context of the Chibnall era and a female doctor and you know, multi-ethnic cast and so on. It almost seems like it's more problematic now. I mean, it was never made a big thing of Captain Jack's sexuality, and it's actually still not clear. I mean, he seems to be pansexual as much as anything. I just think, I mean, what was interesting to me was in the final sort of Moffat series, where they had the character of Bill Potts, who's one of the best companions I think there's ever been. I mean, incredibly strong actress, Pearl Mackie, and incredibly, I think, well written, and no song and dance made about her sexuality, but it was clear, very clear. And again, there wasn't the kind of froth of resistance around it, which there has been in recent series. And I think it's almost like the context of a female doctor has needled. But I think it is, you know, any series that's gonna survive and have an audience and address questions that are worth addressing and be interesting has to kind of has to culture jam a little bit, I think, and has to have the confidence to do that kind of stuff. And I think that's you know, that's what keeps me interested. But I think the notion of a return to innocence is very striking for me, because it's the only time in life when I feel genuinely chilled is when I'm watching Doctor Who. I have that innocence again, which I don't have for anything else, really. So yeah, I think that's definitely got to be part of the nostalgia thing, which always brings with it a danger of sort of reactionariness and you know, conservativeness, small c. But I think it's also very invigorating and, you know, life enhancing.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We've only got a couple of minutes before the next panel, so I think I'm going to wrap up. There's some really interesting discussion and questions in the chat though, so if anybody wants to respond privately or pick it up at a later point, that would be fantastic. And apologies if I didn't get round to your question. Thanks to our three speakers again, Mareike, Beth and Ivan, for fantastic papers, and thanks everybody for a wonderful Q&A. Thank you.